June 24, 1941. Somewhere in the blistering heat of the western desert behind British lines in North Africa, a group of Allied mechanics huddled around a captured German armored car, the SdKfz 222. Its angular diamond-shaped hull still dusted with Libyan sand, and they were about to uncover a secret that would ripple across battlefields from the dunes of Africa to the frozen steppes of Russia, changing how soldiers fought and died in the most unexpected way. The vehicle looked every bit the menacing predator German propaganda had promised: sleek, sloped armor plates that caught the sunlight like polished steel, an open-topped turret bristling with a 20mm autocannon, and a coaxial machine gun wheels spaced wide for stability, and a reputation for vanishing across the horizon at speeds up to 80 kilometers an hour faster than most tanks could even turn their turrets. German crews had been told this was battlefield protection incarnate, that the clever angles would deflect bullets like rain off a tin roof, and that their reconnaissance missions would be swift, surgical, and safe. But as these British mechanics from the 8th Army, part of the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers Detachment, attached to the 7th Armored Division, the legendary Desert Rats prepared for a simple field test. They had no idea they were about to shatter that illusion forever. The captured SdKfz 222 had been abandoned 2 days earlier during a chaotic skirmish near the Halfaya Pass, its crew fleeing after a British 25-pounder artillery shell had blown a track off and left it immobilized in a wadi. The mechanics towed it back under cover of darkness to a makeshift workshop behind a ridge near Sidi Rezegh, where supply trucks formed a protective ring and the constant drone of RAF Hurricanes overhead kept Luftwaffe spotter planes at bay. The lead mechanic, a wiry sergeant named Thomas Hargreaves from Birmingham, who'd spent the pre-war years panel beating Austin sedans at the Longbridge factory, ran his calloused fingers over the hull, measuring with calipers and shaking his head at what he found: 8mm on the sides, 5 on the bottom, and rear deck barely the thickness of 4 stacked. Credit cards, even with the aggressive sloping that was supposed to increase effective thickness by forcing bullets to travel farther through the steel. It was shockingly thin, thinner than the body panels on some civilian cars back home. Hargreaves muttered to his mate Corporal Jenkins, a former garage hand from Liverpool, that he wouldn't trust this tin can to stop a thrown spanner, let alone a bullet. But orders were orders, and intelligence needed hard data. So they began the test, starting small with Webley revolvers. 9mm rounds pinged off harmlessly at anything beyond point-blank range. The armor was doing its job against pistols. Then came the Sten submachine guns, cheap stamped metal weapons beloved by commandos. But again, at combat ranges, the 9mm parabellum rounds either ricocheted or left shallow dimples with a bit of spalling on the inside where fragments flaked off, but no penetration. The Germans hadn't lied about protection against light weapons, but Hargreaves wasn't satisfied. He wanted to know what the standard British infantry rifle could do, so Jenkins fetched a Lee Enfield No. 4 Mako, the workhorse of the British Army, chambered in .303. British, a bolt-action rifle that had served since the Great War and was still the primary weapon of most Tommies in the desert. They loaded standard Mark 7 ball ammunition, first 174 grain. Bullets at 2,440 feet per second and fired at 50 yards. The rounds struck with sharp cracks, but either glanced off the sloped plates or embedded shallowly in the steel. No penetration. Hargreaves nodded. That was expected. But then came the twist. Jenkins produced a clip of W Mark I armor-piercing rounds issued specifically for situations like this. 93-grain bullets with hardened steel cores designed to punch through light armor and developed in the interwar years precisely because military planners knew thin-skinned vehicles would appear on future battlefields. The proof standard required 60% penetration of 8mm plate at 175 yards. Jenkins, a competitive shooter before the war, who'd won medals at Bisley, took careful aim at a flat section of the side hull where the slope was minimal and the armor perpendicular to his barrel. He exhaled slowly, squeezed the trigger, and the rifle bucked. The bullet struck with a sharp metallic clang and punched clean through. A neat round entry hole on the outside, a jagged star-shaped exit on the inside with metal petals peeled back like a tin of sardines opened by a bayonet. The mechanics crowded around, running fingers over the holes. In stunned silence they fired. Again and again at different ranges and angles under 100 yards with near-perpendicular hits. The W Mark I rounds went through every time at longer ranges or oblique angles. Penetration became less reliable, but in the close, chaotic ambushes of desert. Warfare where distances could collapse to 50 meters or less. A British infantryman with armor-piercing ammunition could kill a German armored car crew with nothing more than his rifle. The implications exploded outward like the spall inside. That Hull intelligence officers compiled urgent reports, tank crews were briefed, infantry squad leaders received updated tactical guidance. Suddenly, the SdKfz 222 wasn't an untouchable scout. It was a target. A rifleman with the right bullets could disable it, wound, or kill its three-man crew, and force the survivors to bail out into the open desert where Bren guns and bayonets waited. But to understand how this moment came to be, we have to go back to the beginning, back to the ashes of the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, when a defeated Germany was forbidden from building tanks outright, but armored cars occupied a gray area in the treaty language, a loophole the Reichswehr and later the Wehrmacht exploited with ruthless efficiency. If they couldn't have panzers, they'd build wheeled Predators that could scout, screen, and strike, and thus in the mid-1930s, German military planners gathered in secret rooms in Berlin, poring over maps of potential European battlefields. They needed a vehicle that could race ahead of advancing columns, gather intelligence on enemy dispositions, survive brushes with infantry, and vanish before heavier opposition arrived. Speed and mobility, working protection, was secondary because doctrine assumed reconnaissance units would observe from afar, not slug it out in sustained combat. The SdKfz 222 emerged from these requirements built on a modified Horch 801 heavy car chassis with four-wheel drive and four-wheel steering, a marvel of engineering, that allowed pirouettes in tight spaces, though training manuals warned drivers never to engage four-wheel steering above 20 kilometers per hour, or risk flipping the vehicle at higher speeds. Production began in 1937 at the Horch factory. In Zwickau, and the vehicle looked futuristic. Angular armor plates sloped at extreme angles to maximize deflection. A 10-sided, open-topped turret protected by wire mesh screens to flick away hand grenades. The initial armament was a 20mm KWK-30 autocannon paired with an MG-13 machine gun, later upgraded to the superior MG-34 in 1938, and by 1942 the faster-firing KWK-38. The crew of 3 operated in a space barely larger than a modern compact car, the driver up front peering through, a narrow armored visor. The commander and gunner crammed into the turret. The Horch V8 engine came in 3 5-liter 75 horsepower, or 3.8-liter 90 horsepower variants, depending on the model, and the vehicle could hit 80 kilometers per hour on roads, respectable cross-country performance on firm sand. But the armor was the compromise, 8 millimeters. All around, in early models roughly the thickness of 4 credit cards, later mid-production vehicles from 1939 got 14. 5 millimeters up front, but the sides stayed 8, and even the final 1942 variants with 30 millimeters frontal armor retained those paper-thin sides. German engineers knew the limitations. They'd calculated that speed would keep the vehicle out of trouble, that angled armor would deflect most rifle fire at range, and that the vehicle's role didn't require standing toe-to-toe with tanks. Propaganda films showed bullets bouncing harmlessly off sloped plates. Training manuals assured crews they were safe, and the psychological effect was crucial. Soldiers had to believe in their machines, or they'd hesitate to push into the unknown early campaigns. Validated that confidence in September 1939, during the invasion of Poland, the SdKfz. U-222 raced through Polish lines. Polish forces equipped with outdated weapons and few anti-tank rifles struggled to respond to vehicles. Gathered intelligence, disrupted rear areas, and retreated before effective counterattacks in May 1940. France fell in 6 weeks, the SdKfz 222. Screened panzer divisions exploited breakthroughs and outmaneuvered heavier, but slower, French tanks. French infantry, disorganized and retreating, rarely landed hits. And in April 1941, the Balkans campaign saw the vehicles dominate mountainous terrain against Yugoslav and Greek forces armed with World War I leftovers by spring 1941, German reconnaissance. Crews had fought 3 successful campaigns. Their faith in the SdKfz 222 was ironclad. Then came Africa, the Africa Corps, officially formed on January 11, 1941, under Erwin Rommel, who arrived in Tripoli on February 12, the first reconnaissance. Units of Aufklärungsabteilung 3 landed on February 14, equipped with SdKfz 222's among other vehicles, and immediately pushed into the desert to probe British positions. The desert was a different beast. Vast open spaces with no cover temperatures. Swinging from 50 degrees Celsius by day to near freezing at night abrasive sand that infiltrated every mechanism and supply line stretching hundreds of kilometers across empty wasteland. But the open terrain played to the SdKfz 222's strengths. Speed was king, visibility stretched for kilometers, and firm gravel surfaces gave excellent traction. The vehicles performed brilliantly in early 1941. British forces, reeling from Italian defeats, were caught off guard by German aggressiveness. Reconnaissance. Units pushed deep into British rear areas, mapping supply dumps, pinpointing headquarters, and retreating before Matilda tanks could respond. But the desert also stripped away illusions. There was nowhere to hide once spotted, and British forces had been fighting since June 1940. When Italy entered the war, they'd learned the desert's lessons, developed tactics, and most importantly, were equipped with modern weapons including Lee Enfield rifles and plentiful W Mark I armor-piercing ammunition. The first captures came almost immediately, fluid. Desert warfare meant vehicles were abandoned when damaged or out of fuel. During Operation Crusader, launched November 18, 1941, to relieve Tobruk, confused tank battles swirled around Sidi Rezeg. British forces broke through on November 27, relieved Tobruk, and by mid-December, Rommel had withdrawn to El Agheila. Dozens of German vehicles littered the battlefield, many SdKfz 222's among them. British recovery teams systematically collected, them shipping some to the School of Tank Technology at Chertsey in Surrey for detailed analysis. But field commanders needed answers now, so mechanics like Hargreaves and Jenkins conducted immediate tests behind the lines. The results spread like wildfire through the 8th Army intelligence bulletins went out. A British rifleman with armor-piercing rounds could kill an SdKfz 222 at 150 meters or more. Tank crews learned their coaxial Besa machine guns could penetrate at close range, iffy. The concentrated fire the boy's anti-tank rifle was overkill, penetrating 23. 2 millimeters at 100 yards, and the 2-pounder anti-tank gun could punch through at any range. Commonwealth troops, Australians, New Zealanders, South Africans, Indians received the same briefings. Even Free French forces learned the secret on the Eastern Front. The Soviets made their own discoveries on August 23, 1941. The Red Army displayed a captured SdKfz 221, the 222's smaller cousin near Moscow, and on September 7, an SdKfz 222 was sent to the gas factory in Gorky. Chief designer Vitaly Grachev inspected it, thoroughly impressed by the faceted, angled armor. But noting the thin 8mm sides, Soviet engineers were already developing the BA-64 light armored car since July 17, 1941, and incorporated the German hull shape, but learned. From the mistakes, the BA-64 had 9mm side armor slightly better, though still vulnerable to AP rifle fire, but it was smaller, lighter at 2. 4 tons with a 2-man crew and designed for mass production using Gazi 64 Jeep components, over 9,510 BA-64s were built between 1942 and 1946, dwarfing the under 1,000 SdKfz 222’s produced from 1937 to 1943. The BA-64 served into the 1950s exported to Poland, Czechoslovakia, China, North Korea, Yugoslavia, and fought in post-war conflicts. Its simplicity and numbers trumped German sophistication. British designs like the Daimler armored car entering service in 1941 had 16mm sides and 30mm. Front mounted a 2-pounder gun and offered real protection. American ordnance teams arriving in late 1942 tested captured SdKfz 222’s with M1 903 Springfield and M1 Garand rifles using M2 armor piercing. 30.06 rounds penetrating up to 12.7mm at 100 yards. Far beyond the German 8mm sides, the Thompson submachine gun and M1 carbine were marginal, but full-power rifles with AP ammo were lethal. By late 1942, the SdKfz 222’s vulnerability was common knowledge across Allied and Soviet forces. Impact angle mattered. The extreme sloping could cause ricochets at 60 degrees from perpendicular, but in fluid combat vehicles often presented flat sides or rear plates, especially when maneuvering or engaging targets. German crews learned to avoid exposing flanks, but in the chaos of battle it was unavoidable. The open turret left crews vulnerable to grenades, mortar fragments, and air bursts. The cramped interior meant one penetrating round could wound multiple crewmen. Spalling turned the inside into a blender, limited fuel, and ammo meant prolonged fights were suicidal, and tires, though puncture-resistant, could immobilize the vehicle, negating its speed. German leadership recognized the problem. By early 1942, combat reports from Africa and Russia detailed losses to rifle fire unit commanders begged for better protection. The response was the SdKfz 234. Puma, an 8-wheeled beast with 30mm front and 14. 5mm side armor, a 50mm KWK-39 gun, and 85 km per hour. But development delays meant first deliveries in late 1943. Only about 400 were built before production ended in September 1944. Too few too late. Meanwhile, SdKfz 222 production ceased in late 1943 after roughly 990 vehicles. Early models had 8mm armor. Throughout mid-1939, upgrades added 14. 5mm front, the 1942 E B got 30mm front, 90 horsepower engine, and KWK-38, but sides stayed 8mm. Related variants like the SdKfz 221, 223, 260, and 261 shared the same fatal flaw as the war dragged on. SdKfz 222’s were relegated to rear area security convoy, escort, anti-partisan duties, and training. Where opposition lacked AP ammunition, the 20mm cannon remained deadly against soft targets, but frontline reconnaissance became suicidal by 1944–45. Allied and Soviet advances overwhelmed German defenses. Reconnaissance vehicles had little impact. The war was won by tanks, artillery, air power, and industrial might. The SdKfz 222 survives in museums. The Wheatcroft Collection, Bovington Tank Museum, Australian War Memorial, and American Heritage Museum. Boast examples. Visitors run hands over the 8mm plates and understand instantly why Allied soldiers smirked when they saw one coming. The vehicle was a masterpiece of 1930s design, fast, reliable, agile, well-armed, but its armor was a lie. 8mm of steel that German engineers thought sufficient in 1938 became a death trap. By 1941, as armor-piercing rifle ammunition proliferated, it reveals the brutal truth of military design. Every compromise has consequences. Prioritize speed, and you sacrifice protection. Assume your doctrine will hold, and reality will punish you. German crews paid with their lives, trusting machines that couldn't save them. Allied soldiers gained confidence. Knowing their rifles weren't useless against armor, the Emperor had no clothes, and once the secret was out, the SdKfz 222, once a symbol of German invincibility, became just another target in the crosshairs of history, a thin-skinned relic of miscalculation. In a war that forgave no mistakes, the revelation didn't win the war, but for the infantryman in the desert, staring down a dust cloud on the horizon, it meant he wasn't helpless. It meant he could fight back, and sometimes that's everything.